Any sense of self and belonging can't be disconnected from our emotional life, and that was clear from what David was saying there. They're powerfully entwined. Tell us briefly about your story. You're living here in Scotland, but feel as much Kenyan as Scottish.
I do, yes. I grew up in Kenya and I spent my whole childhood there, and then we moved to Scotland when I was 13. And I have a Scottish father and a Kenyan mother, and they met here in Edinburgh in the 60s when she was studying. When I was growing up in Kenya, we had all these wonderful stories about Scotland. And so people have asked, when you come at the age of 13, it must be very difficult. And no, it wasn't, because it was something quite exciting. It was, finally, we're going to go and see Scotland. And so when we moved here, it wasn't supposed to be a permanent move, but it has become a permanent move. But I do feel very, very Scottish, and I feel 100% Kenyan as well. And I think it helps that I go back to Kenya frequently. So at least every year we'll go back. I have 2 children. I tend to take them back with me because it's important for them to have those Kenyan roots too, because their Scottish culture is nailed. We're here and we expose them to a lot of the Scottish culture, whatever that might be. But yes, it's important, I think, to have these multiple identities and senses of belonging.
And this dual heritage,
Absolutely.
Which is hugely important, and perhaps even more so as a storyteller. And I know that you've said that certain issues probably that are difficult, are clunky to address formally, come to you much more easily, and they're more salient if they're done through stories.
One of the beautiful things about stories is that you can tell one story to 100 people, and each person, each individual will take whatever it is that they need to take from the stories. But stories give you an insight into a world that you're quite familiar with, but equally to worlds that you have absolutely no idea about, or you have misconceptions about, because often we get the same stereotypes being produced about certain people, about certain places. And stories are a really powerful way of challenging those perceptions. And for me as a storyteller, whenever I tell my stories, I make sure to include different aspects of language. If I'm using props, then it's things like fabric, the musical elements that come into it. All of these things build up a much bigger picture of what a place might be like, or a new world might be like. And I think it's great fun to introduce people to new ideas.
Would you accept, though, that for some people having a dual identity brings its challenges, and there can be negative elements to it too?
If you have a dual citizenship, then you, for me anyway, you have an obligation of duty or of loyalty to a particular place. And so I think there can be ways that you're torn in two, or maybe having to choose between one or the other. So yes, I think there are certain challenges.
David, do you think it's fair to say that the times we're in some ways, we're at a crossroads of how we shape and define what it is to be a citizen of where you live?
I think very much so. It's very much a state of flux. People have always moved, and people have migrated in hordes, in masses, or individually for millennia. I think in Europe, there was less of that going on in the 20th century because of the disruption of the wars and everything going on in the first half of the century. But in the second half, with greater affluence, more tourism, access to more communication and the internet, the distances have shrunk, and people's expectations that they can go and be anywhere, buy property, go work, go spend 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years in a different country are completely and utterly changed from the way they were 20, 30, 40, certainly 50 years ago. Citizenship is a curious thing, and this again has changed over many different periods, and there have been different types of citizenship, from Roman citizenship, where you were a citizen of the Roman Empire, to becoming a citizen of a city-state, to citizen of a nation-state as we have today. That has always evolved, and I'm sure it will continue to evolve.
What about the term citizen of the world? What would that mean to you, Mara? Is it about the physical freedom of movement, or is it something that's rooted in the heart?
I think that we are all citizens of the world by nature of being human. But I think citizens of the world, you're rooted to something, I believe. I think that if you have grown up in a place, or you have memories of a place, or memories through your parents or through your grandparents, you can acquire new memories. And these form allegiances to places. And I think that once you have those allegiances, then you feel like you are a citizen, or you have a sense of belonging to a particular place. So even whenever people are moving around, whether it's for a sense of adventure or whether it's seeking sanctuary or you're seeking something, so we're constantly on the move, you will always look back to where you have been, and you will bring moments or parts of that along with you. And so I think citizenship, it's not just about the piece of paper that entitles you to do X, Y, Z. It's about something much deeper, something within us as people.
Do you think that because it was fluid, that now, because it's seen as being under threat, we're nervous about who we are, about our identity, and that can be unsettling too?
I think it is unsettling. I think people have got a lot more mixture in their bloodlines, if you like. So it's not quite clear exactly where anybody specifically belongs or where their allegiances should be. And I think, coming back to this thing about the citizen of the world, that's a very much an emotional thing. There is, on the other hand, there is the obligations we were talking about earlier on, which is a two-way thing. One is a state will look after you in certain respects, and you have obligations towards the state in terms of voting for the best outcome that you think is possible, as we have in a democratic election. And that has got to be done in a specific domain. And I think you can feel that you belong in a lot of other places, but then there are these, how you manage these instruments of obligation, which work both ways.
Isn't it tricky, or is it tricky, if we get too hung up on this idea of citizenship, who we are, where we belong, that can sometimes be divisive and can make us suspicious of people who are not part of that. And I'm thinking about, particularly Mara as a storyteller, how perhaps through stories we actually learn more about other people. And that's one way of saying, look, you may not have been born in this country, but you too can be a citizen.
Stories and citizenship and changing perceptions of what people are about and what their histories are like and their cultures are like, I think that absolutely changes how people are viewed. I think when we hear certain stereotypes propagated everywhere around us, then it's very easy to build up that single story of what a person is like. But through stories that are not just about, for example, the war in Syria and Syrian refugees having to move, that's the one story that we always hear. But if you were to hear other stories from different parts of that particular culture, then it builds it up into something that then allows you to embrace somebody in a new way. And I think that's, across the board, regardless of who people are or where they're from. I think it's much easier to embrace somebody if perhaps physically they look like you, because then you imagine that there are going to be these similarities, or you assume that there are going to be similarities. And I remember I was in Kenya for a storytelling festival, and I met a Nigerian author who was there for this festival, and she grew up in Wales. And she said, I don't know how to be African among Africans. And I thought that was just wonderful. It's never left me, because I think it's, how we are with other people.
I think that was a discussion that came up with the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, talking about going to Nigeria from America and remember, because it's such a different pattern of behaviour. And, I think that's a lovely thing, is just, even when I go home, I'm going to somewhere that's completely different. It's rural, it's wonderful. And then you go, yes. So there's always going to be that. Just finally, both of you, does this moment in time feel to you like a crisis point? Or could something positive come from this renewed focus on citizenship and belonging?
I'm not sure that it's a crisis point, but it's a point of considerable confusion for a lot of people from an individual point of view, and also from a global point of view, thinking about the refugee problems, where they belong and how they should fit in. But being a positive sort of person, I do think something positive will come out of all of this, even though looking at the news every day, it does seem to be negative. I think ultimately we will come to a resolution of how we should deal with the movement of people, and where people belong and how they interact with their local environment or their local infrastructures. And I think that the world that we will see in 30 years' time will be very, very different from what it is today, perforce, because people's expectations will be that they can move around. And the infrastructures that we have at the moment need to catch up with that, not only in this country, but everywhere.
I'm an optimist, and so I have to be positive about it. However, there are concerns, especially when I think about my children and how the world that they're going to grow up with, because I think that we have all benefited so much from this freedom of movement. We can go wherever we want, do whatever we want, and just the exchanges within that. So even studying abroad at university, when Brexit hits, then is that going to be a possibility? And how does that affect our children and the world that they're going to live in? So yes, I am concerned about things like that. But I think, as David says, I think there has to be a way that we work through that, because the expectations across the world are going to grow. And as we have more people in the world, we're going to have to find a better way to manage that, because currently as it is, it's not working too well. But we'll get there.
Mara Menzies and David Goodman, thank you both very much for joining me this morning. And Mara has a show at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, The Illusion of Truth. It's at the Scottish Storytelling Centre throughout August. All the best with that. Coming up.